أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. The last few days that we've been talking together, we've been speaking about misguidance. The last, I think, 2 or 3 days, we focused on causes of misguidance. We spoke about Allah and how He takes away the guidance that He would otherwise offer, the tawfiq that He would otherwise offer. And sometimes, actually, if we are insistent on pursuing a path of misguidance, He reinforces that path. And then we spoke about Iblis, Shaitan, who is, of course, a force of misguidance. And we spoke a little bit about how he works and what the different kinds of dangers are that we face because of him. And also, to some extent, how we can mitigate that, how we can relieve ourselves of that misguidance and maintain our path of guidance despite his existence. So these kinds of misguidance that we've been talking about, the causes of misguidance, they are, maybe you could call them supernatural, right? Allah and His tawfiqat that He gives us, and Iblis and the way he insinuates and whispers into our minds. But misguidance is not limited to these supernatural means. A more obvious form of misguidance are the ideas that we're often exposed to in the form of all the ideas that come to us. I'm going to use the word media, right? Not in the sense, usually when you use media, we think of TV and internet and those kinds of things, but media in the general sense as a medium of communicating ideas. So in the olden days, they would talk about kutub al-dalal, books that cause misguidance. But now we can talk more generally about all the different ways that misguidance is communicated to us. If we are exposed to these kinds of misguidance in the form of ideas that call into question those things that hold us fast to the tenets of faith, that cause us to call the Islamic way of life into question, that make religion and God and morality and these things seem like irrelevant and superficial and even subjective, if those kinds of ideas find their place in our hearts, they at very least can shake our faith. And at worst, they can totally obliterate faith within us and call us towards a kind of secularism or pluralism or any sort of idea that's away from God. So it's important to first start with our understanding about Islam itself. Right? Islam is based on a set of principles and ideas. We have our tenets of faith that are an expression of reality. Right? Our faith is not simply a subjective belief or opinion. And this term belief, I don't know if you've gotten a sense of it in Australian kind of usage of it. I think it's universally, I've seen it in the English-speaking world. Right, when we use the word belief, we often use it in the sense of accepting something as true despite the lack of any evidence for it. Right, so would someone say, for instance, I believe it's nighttime, or I believe it's 2018? Right, that would be a pretty nonsensical thing to say, unless maybe they're in a state of amnesia and they were confused, they didn't know what it was, and they got confused about the year. But it's something that's factual. You don't use the word belief for something that's factual, that's real. Whereas you would say, I believe in unicorns, or I believe in fairies, or I believe in some other thing that has absolutely no basis. That's the correct way of using belief in modern usage. And that's a travesty, because that's not at all what we mean when we talk about iman. Right? Iman and yaqeen, this is belief in something because it's true. Because I have evidence for it, if I accept it to be true because of the evidence, that's where iman comes into place. That's where yaqeen and certainty come into place. Right? And so Islam is founded on a set of principles that are based on reality, that Allah does in fact exist. Now, if you expose yourself to ideas of atheism and agnosticism that call that very existence of God into question, let's say what evidence do we have for him? Our senses can't perceive him. In the past, science was so rudimentary and so basic that it didn't have the ability to explain many things in the world. We observed, seemingly supernatural events in the world, an eclipse, for instance, and we couldn't explain what caused it, and so we'd say it must be God. Right? So this idea is sometimes referred to by atheists as having a belief in a God of the gaps. Wherever there's a gap in your understanding of how things work, that's where you reach out to God and say, oh, this must be where God, this is the proof that God exists, because there's no other explanation that we have yet for explaining that particular phenomenon. But as our understanding progresses, as we understand more about the world, in modern terms, as scientific knowledge increases, then we start to understand what the mechanics were behind that. We're able to see what forces were at play, and slowly, if that's our conception of God, we simply call on God and we think that we only need God in those places where there are gaps, then as the gaps are filled, then God becomes irrelevant. And so if these ideas start to creep in, if we start to expose ourselves to these ideas of agnosticism or even atheism, agnosticism meaning that we don't have knowledge, right? Gnosis, we have no gnosis and knowledge, and I can't say for sure whether God exists or not, and so it's kind of a belief in a question mark. I believe that I don't know, and I can't know, and it's not possible to know. And so it's basically irrelevant. If that's your position on the existence of God, then basically God is irrelevant to your life. And you have no role for him. And if he does exist, so be it. Maybe one day I'll turn to spirituality and I'll do something that makes me feel good and gives me some meaning in my life, at least perceived meaning in my life. If not, I'll just live my life as I want to, as a moral person, or I'll make my decisions based on other standards, and I'll live my life in that way. But basically, there's no role for God if that's your position. The position of the atheist is a more irrational, illogical position where they don't simply say that since we have no evidence for God, since we don't have any evidence for God, we don't know whether he exists or not. They'll say actually the lack of evidence of God is evidence that he doesn't exist, which is an illogical statement, an irrational statement. The lack of evidence doesn't prove that the thing doesn't exist. It just means that you don't have the evidence yet. You don't have access to that evidence yet, right? But that's the position of an atheist. It says adamantly there is no God, and I can prove it. What's the proof? That we don't have any evidence for him, right? So it's an illogical position, but that's the position of an atheist. The point, though, is that we are called on to believe in Allah. Why? Because he does in fact exist. Do we have proof of that? Yes, on many levels. Our gut tells us, our fitrah tells us that he does in fact exist. It's kind of beyond the pale of logic, or before logic is the fitrah. But then logically also, there are very rational, very reasonable arguments for the existence of God as a necessity to explain the existence of anything else. Nothing else can possibly exist if everything else requires a cause, requires something to make it. How can a cosmos filled with things that require something else to make itself? There must be something that is unmade, that doesn't require being made to make the rest of the things. Everything else can work internally, but the existence of such a system that has all of these contingent and dependent beings that can't exist independently, it can only exist if there's something outside of that system that doesn't require another maker, something else to make it. So lines of reasoning like that are very solid, very convincing, and there's they leave no room for doubt that God does in fact exist. If we expose ourselves to these ideas of agnosticism and atheism, it starts to erode, potentially starts to erode that faith that we have. Right? Especially when you think of the eloquence with which sometimes atheistic arguments are put forward. The kinds of doubts sometimes that are put forward, they can really have an effect and erode away our faith. That's at the level, that big level of the existence of God. And if you think of the immediate kind of arguments or the establishment of the truth of Islam, right? The kinds of questions and doubts that we might be exposed to erode away the belief that the Quran is truly the word of God, that the Prophet is truly the Prophet of God, that he has these particular qualities of infallibility and perfect guidance and these kinds of things, if those start to be eroded away, then our faith itself will end up crumbling. One of the challenges that we face in the modern world, in a secular society where religion and God and anything beyond the level of physical and material is considered to be non-existent, one of the problems with this kind of society is that we are encouraged to expose ourselves to everything. Right? We're encouraged to learn about everything. It's seen as a sign of an intellectual person. Someone who is smart and who is capable will learn about everything and expose himself to everything. My contention is that that's extremely risky and extremely dangerous. If we are to recklessly plow into all these ideas, many of which are in stark contradiction to Islamic belief, I should say in contradiction to reality, without proper preparation for that, without the ability to deal with those kinds of things, then this is not intelligent. This is actually very foolish. It's like throwing yourself into water before knowing how to swim, before even thinking about the consequences and how you're going to deal with the situation once you're in that water. But this is something that we are constantly exposed to. Our educational system is like this. Our society in general is like this. We are encouraged to expose ourselves to everything, expose ourselves to various ideas, and that makes perfect sense if you don't believe that anything's actually true. Right? In a secular system, there is really no truth. Truth is subjective. You can have one opinion, I can have one opinion. There is no standard for what is real. Reality may be limited to, at least you can agree on material things, that something solid, for instance, exists, and this is brown, and this is this, and this is that. Like those kinds of material, trivial things we can agree on. But anything more important than that, what is morality, what is right and what is wrong, it's not based on anything real, because there is nothing beyond the physical. So who's to say that it's wrong to have relations outside of marriage and it's right within marriage? Says who? A God that we don't know, who we have no evidence for? Society, that's something. In a secular kind of conception, society has something to say. So what we agree on, if we all agree that something is right, then that's fine. That can become our standard. We'll all agree to say that this is right and that's wrong. But it's temporary, it's subjective. As society changes, as standards of decency or standards of propriety change, then those standards of morality also will shift. Right? A clear sign of that is, for instance, in the way people dress. Right? Think of how that's evolved over the past century or 2 centuries that we have access to photographs and these kinds of things, and think how people used to dress a century or 2 centuries ago, and what the norms were and what was considered improper at that time, and progressively how that's changed over time until our modern time. Now, what's considered decent would have been scandalous 20, 50, 100 years ago. Right? So if that's the standard, if the standard of morality and what's right and wrong is public consensus, then it makes sense to learn everything, to expose yourself to everything. You'll find sometimes people who have, even if they're religious or they have some sort of belief themselves, if they're secular basically in their way of thinking, they won't feel any sort of obligation to raise their children in the tradition that they themselves believe to be right. Because they'll say, this is what I was raised in, this is what makes sense to me. I am Jewish or Christian or whatever, or I have this kind of new age spirituality that I've come to. I don't want to, it would be unfair of me, it would be oppressive of me to force my child to come to synagogue with me and attend in this particular religious tradition. Let him or her kind of explore them himself and figure his own way out, and he'll come to something. Maybe he'll come to this, maybe he'll come to something else. The whole role of religion gets reduced to a palliative. Okay? Something that if you need it, if you feel benefit in it, then you tap into religion because it gives you some sense of meaning. It gives you some calm when you face the difficulties of life. Not that it's actually something real, that there is actually a God that that requires to be worshipped, that there is actually a standard of truth and falsehood. that there is a right and a wrong. There is some way of life that I have to adopt to please God or to live in a way that's pleasing to God. None of that's important anymore because it's all subjective. So if that's our mentality, which is the dominant mentality in our society, then it makes sense to expose yourself to everything. So our educational system is based on that kind of a mentality. And if we're not careful, then we're exposing our kids to that kind of mentality as well. Right? Where everything's fair game. You learn about anything, you read anything. The more you expose yourself to things, the better, the more rounded of a personality you become. And the more open-minded you become. That is true, but is that desirable? As Muslims, when we know that there is truth, and we know what that truth is, it doesn't make any sense for a parent or an educator or a community leader to advocate for a system that recklessly and without constraint exposes our children to any sort of idea. What we do need to do is educate them thoughtfully. There is a role in exposing yourself in a controlled way to things. Right? The same way we think of vaccinations, for instance. Right? You don't vaccinate people by just unleashing full strength disease on a population. You give a kind of deadened down, weak form of the bacteria or some sort of proteins left from the cells, the cell walls, and you give that to the patient, and then they're able to develop an immunity. And then with that sort of process, then they become prepared to face the full strength disease whenever it comes. Now, that same kind of mentality holds true for our educational systems. Since we know that this is true, and we know that other ideas are false, but we also know that, right? So imitating the ostrich and putting your head in the ground, for instance, doesn't make those things go away, right? So living in a vacuum or in a sheltered way, sheltering our children from those ideas may have a temporary benefit of saving them from harm right now when they're very young, but it's only a matter of time before they are off on their own. They're in university, in situations where they're exposed to these ideas on their own, and if they're not prepared, then they're like that inoculated person who's exposed to that disease without any sort of preparation. So there's a place for exposure and education, but it must be done carefully. Not only for our children, for ourselves. This is not something that's only children are susceptible to false ideas. They may be more impressionable because they don't yet have the maturity, they don't yet have the wisdom, they don't yet have the tools to be able to think rationally about things. They may not even be grounded in Islamic principles fully yet. And so when they hear something else that's eloquently put, that's kind of the dominant force in society, it might become very challenging to hold fast to something, especially if they don't even know that very well. Right? So our educational system it cannot be dogmatic. And sometimes religious parents make the mistake of dogmatically teaching Islam to their children. Right? Telling them that, for instance, if a child asks, how do we know God exists or does God exist? If they ask that question, it's like, don't even ask that question. How dare you ask that question? That's off limits. Right? Of course God exists. That's just the way it is, and don't ask any questions. If that's the extent of your discussion about the existence of God when that question arises, then that child's not prepared for serious questions and serious doubts that will be raised by other people who have actually thought about this idea and have come up with arguments to try to debunk the belief in God. Right? So a dogmatic approach to rearing your child or even your own education does not work. If you simply say that I believe Islam is true, that's all I know, that's all I've been raised with, I don't really read much, I don't understand much, I don't ask many questions, I know it's true. If that's the extent of your thought that you put into your Islamic belief, then it's a very weak belief. You may be safe just because you've gone long enough in your life and you now kind of situate yourself in a family and in a community and in a situation where you no longer are exposed to many doubts because you don't have intellectual discussions, you're not exposed to other kinds of ideas. So you might be safe at that point with that weak belief. Your children will not be. Your children will not be safe if they have that kind of very basic and rudimentary and dogmatic way of thinking about things, as soon as they're exposed to ideas that challenge Islamic ideology, then they'll lose it. They won't have anything to stand on, and at best they'll become pluralistic, and they'll say, well, this makes sense to me, this is what my parents say, this is what I've grown up with, but I can't say why that's wrong, I can't even say why this is right. So if you're convinced about your ideas, then maybe that's right for you. I'm somewhat convinced just because of inertia in my ideas, so this is right for me. At best, you'll have a pluralistic way of thinking of things. At worst, you'll start to think that, well, it doesn't really make any difference. If I call myself a Muslim and you call yourself a Christian, is that even important? As long as we're good people, you hear that very, very commonly. As long as you're a good person, what difference does it make what you call yourself or how you worship God and what name you call? It's a very poetic kind of thing that people often say. And it basically means that Islam and religion is really irrelevant. It's all just about a humanistic kind of morality. As long as we can be good, however we define it as a society, that's the extent of what we need. Anything beyond that is just a means to get to that point. If I'm already a decent person, if I'm already trying to do what's right morally, then what's the purpose in praying and fasting and doing all these other things? Right? So I think this is really a serious kind of a threat that we have. One of the major causes of misguidance are not the shaitan that's whispering in your head, not the other aspects of misguidance that we've talked about, but the ideas that we're constantly exposed to. And we must prepare ourselves and prepare our children to deal with all of that. And if we don't, and we expose ourselves recklessly, then we're setting ourselves up for major catastrophe on the spiritual front. Now, is there no place for being a well-rounded person, exposing yourself to ideas? Certainly. That is a good thing. But on what subjects, on what topics? There are certain critical things that must be firm, and if they are firm, then the rest of it is fine. And there we can, there's plenty of room for subjectivity in many aspects of life. Right? We can definitely exchange ideas and expose ourselves to ideas of different ways of doing things, different ways of solving problems that humans and humanity face. Right? That would be an example of a place where diversity of ideas, exchanging ideas is excellent. That's probably the best way. وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ Shura, this institution of consultation of Islam, that's a magnified form of that, where you're consulting different ideas, exposing yourself to different ideas, and then you take the best from this and that, and you come up with sometimes new solutions, or you find that someone else's solution is better than yours, and you go forward with that. So there are definitely areas of life and areas of thinking where diversity of ideas, exchange of ideas is a wonderful thing. But we can't say that that's a universal thing, that even, for instance, on that topic of belief in God and God's existence, or whether Islam is true or not, and is the Prophet infallible or not, or these key issues, if we expose ourselves there recklessly, again, without preparation, and say, well, I want to hear what everyone else has to say. I want to hear that's really strong. I want to read the best and strongest articulation of an atheist doctrine. Let me go and expose myself to that and read that because it's good to know what they're thinking. If you do that without preparation, then it's foolhardy. In what context should you do it? Well, first of all, ground yourself in your own beliefs. Understand what you believe and why you believe it. Preferably not in a vacuum, right? Education, Islamic education, these kinds of meaningful education should not happen with you alone by yourself with a book, or you yourself listening to lectures, kind of finding your own way. It must be in the context of people who know more than you, who have greater abilities than you. Ideally in the presence of someone who has some training in theology, who has a good grounding in those beliefs and in the philosophy of why we do and believe certain things, and can communicate that to you, teach you that, and answer your questions and answer all your doubts, so that as you yourself with your own intelligence start to question and say, well, that doesn't make sense and this doesn't make sense, they have a reasonable answer and they can offer you an answer and say, well, think about this, what about this, and they can kind of fill all those voids that you have in your understanding. That's just the way our progression in education works. It's never a linear process where you just learn one thing after the other and everything just sits perfectly and it's just everything, progresses very neatly and nicely. A good educational system is always going to be back and forth and up and down, and a teacher will raise a question and cause a doubt and get you to be a little bit uneasy and almost lose your grip, but then catch you before you fall and satisfy you and give you what you need and help you to answer that question and guide you through. It's got to be that kind of tumultuous process, but it should be a tumultuous process that's controlled and guided by someone who knows more than you. Right? Once you have that kind of a grounding, if there is benefit in exposing yourself to something almost as an inoculation again, right? You may not have certain doubts. You may not have a doubt about whether God exists or not, but now you feel very, very grounded in that. You understand why that's important, why you believe that. You have all of that in your head, but then you see that there are people who are passionate about atheism as well. And they're so adamant that God doesn't exist and that religion is irrelevant. So you don't have the doubt yourself, but you see that other people do, and so you want to explore that and see, well, what is their perspective? What is their point of view? Why do they think this? That's fine. You can expose yourself to it, but again, in a very safe environment. Have someone that you can rely on, that you can bounce ideas off of, who knows more than you. So as you slowly and gradually expose yourself to those ideas, you have someone to come and re-ground you in case you lose your way. If you don't have that, then it's foolish to expose yourself needlessly to doubts that you yourself don't have. If you have an organic doubt that issues from inside, then you have a duty to go and fix it and address it. We have no duty. In fact, we mustn't go after doubts that don't already exist in ourselves. We're under no duty like that. If we have a doubt ourselves, then we address it. We must address it. And that's also a good side note, not to delay and procrastinate with those doubts. As doubts arise within ourselves, we're encouraged, and it only makes sense to go ahead and take care of them one by one as they come. Because once they accumulate, they become so big, seemingly big, because you have so many doubts that you have to deal with, that even trying to start the process of addressing them becomes formidable. It's like with anything else. If you procrastinate, then the task becomes much bigger. If you take it step by step and little by little, it's always easier. But we have a hadith that especially focus on this aspect of doubts, that you have to address those doubts as they come. Otherwise, you'll be in a lot of trouble afterwards. But don't go after doubts. Don't create doubts for yourself. Don't expose yourself to doubts unless you see some wise benefit in it. If you're preparing yourself for the exposure that you're inevitably going to receive anyway. So a parent, for instance, might see that my child's going off to university or even in high school, and they're going to be exposed to ideas that are against Islamic values or against Islamic beliefs. So it's important for me now, as they approach middle school, now they have the powers of reason, they can understand an argument. It's important for me now to slowly expose them to these ideas and help them to understand our position and also that position and why that's wrong and this is right, and to have a reasoned discussion about that. Gradually, slowly, in a fruitful and productive way that's leading to greater and greater understanding. If a parent can't do it, and many parents may not feel qualified to do that, then you have to reach out and find people who can do that. Right? If you have more educated members of the community, then go to them, encourage them, get them to have those kinds of sessions and classes and help your youth to prepare themselves before it's too late, before they find those doubts themselves and stumble across them in high school and university and beyond. Anticipate that and address those things ahead of time so that they're prepared when they finally reach them. I'll express the sentiment in a fatwa. So in the olden times, the jurists used to actually talk about this idea of kutub al-dalal in the discussions on buying and selling. So one of the, what's known as al-makasib al-muharrama, those unlawful ways of earning money, is by selling books that have misguided and are potentially misguiding, have misguided ideas and are potentially misguiding to people, right? So let me just read the fatwa to you from Sayyid Sistani's fatwa. And this is I just chose him, but the same fatwa is there for all of our maraja. So he says, يحرم حفظ كتب الضلال ونشرها وقراءتها وبيعها وشراؤها. It's haram, he says, to safeguard books of misguidance, or to circulate them and spread them around, or to read them, or to sell them, or to buy them, with the condition مع احتمال ترتب الضلال لنفسه أو لغيره. If there's a reasonable chance that I, as the one who is doing all of this, will be misguided, or those who are around me, those who have access to it. If I have it in my library, and then my kids have access to that, if they're liable, if they're susceptible to being misguided by that book that I have, then it's unlawful for me to keep that book. فَلَوْ أَمِنَ مِنْ ذَلِكَ جَازَتْ كَمَا يَجُوزُ أو تجوز إذا كانت هناك مصلحة أهم. يجوز. He says, if there's no danger of any of that, if you feel safe, you feel like you yourself have the ability to expose yourself to that book, to read that book. I'm saying book because that's the term that's used. But again, any kind of media, internet, websites, any sort of way of getting information, movies, articles, right? So any way that you get ideas, if those ideas are misguided and are misguiding, then the same applies, right? So if you feel safe for yourself and for those who you're exposing to this material, then it's permissible to have it, to sell it, to buy it, all of that. Especially if there is some greater good that can come of it. So as an example, for me, it's important for me to expose myself and to go and read a book of with an atheistic kind of a bent to it, to understand what his argument is, and to see how I can counter it, how I can help other people to move beyond the doubts that creates. So for me, it's important to have that kind of exposure to it so that I can help other people who might be exposed to it. But if you're not in that position where you have to deal with this at any point, then unless you can make a case between yourself and God for why this is important for you to expose yourself to it, then you mustn't. Right? وَالْمَقْصُودُ بِكُتُبِ الضَّلَالِ, he defines these books of misguidance as مَا يَشْتَمِلُ عَلَى الْعَقَائِدِ وَالْآرَاءِ الْبَاطِلَةِ. Any book, any material that contains beliefs and opinions that are false. سواء ما كانت مخالفة للدين أو للمذهب, whether it's counter to Islam in general or counter to Shi'ism in particular. So for instance, a polemical book of Sunnis or of Wahhabis, for instance, that's trying to debunk Shi'ism and is trying to call into question that, accusing Shias of being, for instance, a Jewish conspiracy, and like all these kinds of things that Wahhabis sometimes will level against the Shia. Right? So reading that and exposing yourself to that without good reason and without the proper preparation is foolhardy. And you mustn't expose yourself to it unless, again, there's some greater good that comes of it, and provided that you feel that you are safe from any sort of negative influence from that kind of exposure. All right, so I ask Allah at the end to shower His mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad, and to give us insight into our beliefs so that we feel so that we come to a level of certainty in those things that are most important, and that we're able to resist the temptation to expose ourselves unnecessarily to causes of misguidance, especially through different forms of media, that we're able to steer clear of those kinds of things, and refrain from the misguidance that would ensue from that. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.